growing here, the tree is ivy. Ivy is one of our native species, a native climber. Produces flowers which then form the blackberries, which are very good for wildlife. The birds come to eat them and love them. Because the ivy is growing around the tree, it makes a kind of niche microclimate, so it's also a very good place for insects to overwinter and for birds to nest. Some people say that ivy growing up the tree can actually kill it, and if the tree is completely surrounded with ivy, then yes, it could actually smother the photosynthetic leaves of the tree and the tree could die. But most ivy you'll find that's growing on this estate is on the mid-canopy trees, and they have a shorter lifespan. So you don't find ivy generally growing in pasture or open areas of woodland pasture, so our champion oak trees are fine. But something like this along the riverbank, where most of these trees wouldn't be living that long because they have quite a short lifespan, because they're things like alder or willow. This example here is a willow coming in here, and oaks. So it's not so much of a problem. But on our more ornamental garden areas, we prefer to maintain the ivy and keep it cut. So the plants you can see growing here is a typical vegetation community that you'd find on bank sides. There's the dead nettle, which is in the Lamium family. If you pull off the flowers, which are white, and squeeze it, produces a very nice nectar, and children often will suck that up. It tastes delicious. That's the dead nettle, because it doesn't hurt you. Growing behind it, however, is the stinger nettle, and that will hurt you if you don't have calloused hands like I do. So here's a little clump of dock plants. If you were unfortunate enough to be stung by a stinger nettle, because the leaf is cold, quite waxy, you can rub that nice cold leaf around where you've been stung, and it takes away the sting. There's an old Fenland phrase saying dock in, dock out, dock rub nettle out, which is kind of the countryside way of saying if you get stung, pull a dock leaf. The tree on the pathway here is another hornbeam. As I mentioned before, hornbeams were traditionally pollarded on the estate. And what you can see is the old mature stem, which has been cut successively for generation upon generation. The stem is called the bole, B-O-L-E, and that produces the head, where all the branches have been cut in the past and it swells. And what's growing off at the top, this is the flush or the spring of the new growth, and that traditionally would have been harvested on a kind of a 5 or 10 or 12 year cycle. Hornbeam is very good for construction and for carving, and if you imagine that most houses here traditionally were built of wattle and daub or such construction, then it's these thin rods of timber, or the poles, that you want to weave together to make hurdles, to make your basis for the wattle and daub wall construction. And the main bit of the bole, I would guess, for a hornbeam of that size is between 150 to 200 years old. So on the estate we have a policy where a tree is dead. If it's not going to be a danger to the public, we leave it as dead wood because it's wonderful habitat. All the holes you can see here are actually where beetle grubs have emerged as they're maturing and living inside as a grub. They mature into a kind of pupa and then they hatch out, and this is where they emerge from. And we have an awful lot of stag's horn beetle on the estate, another one of our biodiversity action plan species. The bark itself, I'll just pull a little off, is great habitat as well for all the creepy crawlers that live in there, and of course nuthatches and woodpeckers love to come in. These holes, the larger ones, have probably been produced by the nuthatch, could possibly be from parakeets as well. The tree itself has a large crack down the middle. That was possibly where earlier branches had come off and fungus had come down, and you can see these gashes going through there of where the tree has tried to heal itself before it eventually died. If it was a lightning strike, you'd see an awful lot of black here, which is the charring of the wood, and there's a little bit of black there. Could be lightning strike, or it could just be the fungus. And if you hear that, inside the tree is quite hollow, and so if you imagine the woodpecker's pecking into that, which is why you hear the noise of the woodpecker. We have 3 species of woodpecker on the site, and it's a lovely old piece of timber and full of creatures. Lichen is a symbiotic organism, meaning there's actually 2 organisms living together. It's an algae combined with a fungus. It grows at a very slow rate of growth. Generally in Britain it's around 1 or 2 millimeters a year. So if you measure the width of the lichen, if that's 4 centimeters and it's growing equally, so you chop that in half, That's about 2 centimetres, which is 20 millimetres. So this lichen plant is probably around 20 years old. They absorb moisture. They take the nutrients from wherever they're growing, whether it's stone or wood, and they're taking out moisture and nutrients from the rain that falls on them. They generally don't like to be too desiccated or dried out, but certain species will tolerate that. So the species that you find growing, for example, on gravestones, which are stone and exposed to the sun, will be different to the species that you find often in a woodland environment where it's a lot more damp and dark. On the 40 Hall estate, I don't know how many species of lichen they actually have, but some are very bright yellow, some are bright orange, and this is the kind of blue-green species. The tree behind me here is the oak tree, just coming into leaf. This is the first flush or spring growth. And in folklore, countryside folklore, you say oak before ash, you're in for a splash. Ash before oak, you're in for a soak. Here you see this is the oak coming into leaf, and it's coming out far earlier than the ash tree, so we won't get much rain this April, so we're in for a splash. So this winter we had numerous floods, and Turkey Brook, which you see flowing in front of us here, is at the highest level in living memory. And the water was undercutting the tree roots, and sadly this large majestic tree fell over, but it gives a great opportunity to look at the root structure. And here on 40 Hill, and especially along the Turkey Brook shore, most of the trees are very shallow rooted because we're on a gravel plug, which is quite unusual geology for any hill, because most hills are composed of clay in this area. Because we have the gravel, the tree roots are spreading along the surface to get nutrients and water, and they don't really go very deep. So we do have a problem with an awful lot of trees. As soon as we have a storm, will often blow over. But here you can actually see the wonderful root structure as it spreads along the bank. And as I said, that was eroded by the water, and now that will slowly become colonised with the native ferns and other plants and mosses that grow along the brook.
And have you lost a lot of trees this season on the estate?
Considering we had the St Jude storm last October-November time, we only lost 4 or 5 trees in that storm, but it actually was the second storm that came where we lost most trees. So it's possible that St Jude's storm had weakened so many existing trees, and then the second big gale that we had was the last kind of death knell that knocked them all over. And this area is known as the Pond Groves. If you consider the medieval manor, the lord of the manor would have the right to a free fishery, and that meant that he could produce lakes or ponds for fish. Now that was important not only because people liked to eat fish, but under Christian rule there were 3 or 4 days of the week when you couldn't eat red meat. So the only food you would eat that was meat would be fish. And it was the lord of the manor who owned the fish, and it was the peasants that would look after them, feed them, and then they would be sold the fish themselves. The pond groves have been remodelled over time. Probably when the Tudor Palace was here, Elsing Palace, they were formal fish ponds. Even King Henry VIII would have seen them, and Elizabeth I. Then in the 18th century they were remodelled into a more naturalistic style, still very much contrived and artificial, but designed to look natural. And what you see today is actually the result of other dredging campaigns over the years where we've tried to increase the water body by taking out the sediment and the silt that's built over the decades. The pond right in front of you is Dipping Pond, and then we have the main Pond Grove lakes east and west. Swing round onto the south shore of the brook within the public park, you'll see that sometime in the past Rhododendron ponticum was planted. It was probably planted here as game cover for pheasant shoots and because it has pleasant flowers. Now Rhododendron ponticum is from China. This is the original form, it's not a cultivar, and you can see that there's no ground cover plants growing underneath it. There are several reasons for this. Firstly, it's evergreen, so it's taking all the light, so hardly any light comes to the ground level. And secondly, the plant produces a toxin, a poison, which poisons the soil and stops other plants from germinating. This is why this plant is classed as invasive, and it's destroying our local ecology because we no longer have the basis of the food web that we need for all the other plants and animals. Now, although it may look nice when it comes in flower, it's possible that that poison is also in the nectar, and so that could be killing off insects, including bees. This lovely old gnarled specimen will be retained for quite a while longer because if we can stop it from spreading, we can maintain it, and then we'll retain the one tree because it's got sentimental value for a lot of people, and also the anglers would like to have some cover for their fishing. The second problem that we have with the rhododendron, not only is it poisoning the soil and stopping other plants from germinating, but it's also a host plant for several different types of fungi. One of those fungi is the phytophthora, and that's a very bad fungus which is killing off all the other trees. So you'll see if you walk along Turkey Brook on the 40 Hall estate, we have a very high percentage of trees with the phytophthora fungus, and it's the rhododendron which is the host plant and a reservoir for this disease. So by removing the rhododendron we can actually preserve the woodland for longer, and we can preserve having the lovely old champion specimens that we have, and we can therefore, hopefully, for future generations, we can ensure that they will also see these lovely old gnarled stems of the sweet chestnuts and the hornbeam. So here you can see the rhododendron has colonised the entire island. It's filling up all the space from the ground level through to the mid-canopy, so it's ousted all the other native species, and the only trees we have left are those which were growing here and were able to push through that canopy to reach the upper light. So really there's no biodiversity on this area other than the two species of the trees in the background and the rhododendron. What I would prefer to see is a complete range of species that you'd find on a lakeside edge or a brook edge in this area.
What sort of fish are in there?
Carp, roach, pike.
Carp, roach and pike.
Bream and tench are meant to be in here, but I've never had a tench. But I always fish on the top for carp, really.
Right.
So it ain't no surprise that I ain't had a tench, but they're meant to be in here. I know they was years ago.
You've got one there now, haven't you?
Yeah. I've got a common carp in that.
You can hear the Canada geese there in the background. Anyway. So the Pongrove Lakes are actually leased to the Enfield Angling Society, who invest a considerable sum of money in maintaining the fishing stock and the lake environment around here, so we're very grateful to have those on the estate. Do occasionally have problems with people thinking that they can fish this lake without being a member of the society, which sadly you can't do, it's not licensed. And I think just now we're going to see a huge carp. The Pongrove Lakes were remodelled in the 18th century. We also have some problems with these lakes that people are bringing their aquarium fish and depositing them here, including terrapins and snapper turtles and the like, which obviously is not good for the native ecology or wildlife. That's a good sized carp.
He ain't bad. Nice little common carp.
A common one, is that?
Yeah.
In the ornamental lake near the hall we have ghost carp, silver carp, common carp, mirror carp, I think.
Oh, so there are all sorts of different sorts of carp, are
Yes, yeah.
Mostly in here are common and mirror.
there? Right. So now you're going to have that one for breakfast, are you?
Nah, you put them all back. Fish them again when they get bigger. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Oh, and back he goes. No harm done.
So he's all right. I mean, he'll recover.
Yeah, people say they feel it, but I don't believe it because in the winter, obviously, it's freezing in there, isn't it? They're not like me or you, like the way they feel things, you know, because they'd be like, sometimes when I catch them in the winter, they're like blocks of ice. It's amazing how, I don't know what sort of metabolism they've got, but obviously it ain't like
Very
that.
fortunate on the 40 Hall estates to have a high number of biodiversity action species, which include many of our ferns. The ones growing on the north bank of the brook here are Blacknam spicant, and it's this kind of vegetation community which I'd like to encourage onto our side of the park. Other plants growing there are the sweet gallingale grass, Carex pendula, hogweed, a variety of different geraniums, and many species that actually love this damp, moist air conditions that we have along the brook. Later on we'll walk up and I'll show you where we've cleared the rhododendron, and you can see that there are no ground cover plants on the area at all. Hopefully this year all the poisons that the rhododendron has produced will wash out. So around the estate you'll notice that most of the trees have got a little silver or aluminium tag which has a unique identifying number. This is our way of surveying the tree stock so we know what trees are growing where, what species, if they have possible problems with fungus, if they're going to be pollarded or felled, and so we know what's growing on the estate. Most trees of a certain girth, which is about 10 centimetre diameter of the trunk, will have one of these tags on them. So this time of year, before the leaves have come out on the broadleaf trees, there's a lot of natural light coming to the woodland floor. And the ground cover plants that you see in front of us, which are a mixture of lords and ladies and wood anemones, are taking advantage of this light coming in. Later on in the year, when all the leaves of the upper canopy are open, there'll be a lot less light coming through, and so you lose the plant species or the possible biodiversity. This is another good reason why we should be pollarding and coppicing certain sections of the woodland here, so we can encourage and promote the light to come to the ground floor, which will encourage different plants, and of course those plants create the basis for the food web and food chains of other things like butterflies, insects, birds. So it's by simply managing the woodland in a more traditional and enhanced way, we can further enhance biodiversity.
And the tree is an old pollard tree.
Exactly, you can see the different rates of growth. So that was the original trunk that was cut along that line. 2 new shoots grew up, and then from those side shoots have come off. So if we reintroduce the pollarding to top here, here and here, the bole of the tree, which is the trunk, will become wider and fatter, and every cut that you make will have numerous new shoots of fresh growth coming off. And actually this part of the tree could live to be over 1,000 years old if you continue to maintain and manage it that way. If you don't, as you can see here, the wood growing up is heavy, it would crack and split, and you lose the entire tree. So this was an ash tree, a victim of one of the storms we had this year. The seeds are like little baby miniature parachutes, and in Old English, ash was one of the runic letters that had this formation, and so possibly that's where the ash tree gets its name from. Second theory is when you look at the tips of the shoots, there's a little black, almost looking like a burnt chip, so maybe that's what gave the word or the name ash. And on this bough that's broken, you can see something quite interesting. There was a hole here, possibly a branch that fell off and the tree was younger that's rotted. And this space or void would be great habitat for creatures like woodpeckers, nuthatches to come and use as their nests. Don't see any evidence for nest material at the bottom, but it's possible it was used for that. And you can see the dark lines running through are fungal infections, and the hardwood, and then the bark on the outer edge. So from the outside, this tree looked perfectly healthy, but actually there was a fungus living within it. It may have been symbiotic, so working together with the tree, or it's probably the phytophthora fungus which is killing off so many of the trees in the woodland, which is a shame.
Listen to that song thrush.
Yeah, the birds at this time of year are just incredible. And behind us sometimes you can hear the kingfisher coming along the brook. But certainly the thrushes, the blackbirds. So the ground cover plant you see in front of us is Lesser celandine. It grows all around the estate and very typical, indicative of old woodland, not to say ancient woodland, but old. It actually grows almost like a small tuber or potato under the ground. And then the growth comes up in February, March time, one of the earliest flowering spring flowers, and you get these lovely yellow flowers all over it. Now yellow at this time of year is a very popular flower colour, mainly because insects who are coming out from hibernation at this time of year can see the ultraviolet light, which we actually see as yellow, but there are patterns in ultraviolet which things like bumblebees can easily see. So most of our spring flowers are often white or yellow for that reason. So as Turkey Brook meanders through the estate, it's eroding on one side of the riverbank and depositing its load of sediment on the other side. And here you can see the classic example on the right-hand side of what's called a slip-off slope, where all the heavy stones, the sediment, are being dropped, and on the left-hand side, the river bank or river cliff, where there's active erosion happening. And when you have this pattern of erosion and deposition, the river actually meanders and causes that kind of sinuous serpentine loop as it goes through the landscape. Now come along the greenway path, which continues straight ahead past the farm onto the Rose and Crown pub. If you turn to the left, however, you can follow up the tracks, which will take you back to Forty Hall through the parkland. The field you can just make out through the back of the trees is leased to the local farm, Copel Manor Farm, and that field is called Upper Primrose Hill. The other side of it, of course, would be Lower Primrose Hill. You can follow this track through and you come back to Meadow Pond and Crater Pond, or you can cut across the Great Lawn and walk up the Lime Avenue to return to the hall.